14th meeting of the Historic Resources Board. Would staff please call roll?
Yes. Chair Bernstein.
Here.
Vice Chair Wimmer.
Here.
Board Member Bauer.
Here.
And Board Member Bunnenberg.
Here.
And Board Member McKinnon is here but stepped out for a moment. And Board Member Kohler is not here.
Okay, thank you. Oral communications. Members of the public may speak to any item not on the agenda. And I see I have no speaker cards. So moving on to any agenda changes, additions, or deletions. So.
Let it be reflected that Board Member Kohler is here. So now we have a quorum of 6.
Right.
There are no changes to the agenda today.
Okay. All right. Minutes approval, June 9th. Any motion to approve or amend? And I had one correction on page 3, the middle. Where it says Chair Bernstein referenced page 78. And it says the ordinance required a first floor be more than 3 feet. And I believe the correction would be the ordinance required a first floor be no more than 3 feet. I think that's been noted at our meeting yesterday.
Thank you.
Yeah, good. Any other corrections? Yeah. Any other corrections? Yes, that's. Our motion to approve is amended. I'll move to approve the amended minutes from June 9th, 2016. Any second to the motion? Second. Okay, any discussion? All approve, say aye. Aye, that's been approved. Thank you. Next is public hearings. Discussion regarding Historic Resources Board study sessions, allowing for preliminary comments on proposed designs early in the design and development process. For information, contact Amy French, amy.french@cityofpaloalto.org. Shall staff have any comment on this agenda item?
Yes, thank you. Amy French here, as noted. So the HRB had requested to have a session on study sessions, and here we are, agendized. And staff put together a staff report to provide a little bit of background and a recommendation. We do have the Architectural Review Board process as a model. They do have a way of doing things that is copacetic with our, state law, the Brown Act. So that is, we can have a less than a quorum, for the board. It could be up to 3 to suffice and not be a Brown Act violation. What the ARB does with their 2 members is we agendize subcommittee meetings at the end of each agenda, and the public is welcome to come, but it's not captured on the, it's not a full quorum meeting. There's no action taken. It's purely discussion, questions, some advice, some direction, but not official formal direction. And so that's a model that works. It's been working for, over a decade, as long as I've been here. And so we think that that would be a good model to replicate for the HRB for study sessions. So that's basically the gist of the report. I don't know if Matt has anything to add.
Thank you. I would just add that the 2 procedures that are available to the ARB currently are the preliminary review, which is an application type which involves a fee and it's actually discussed in the code, and the committee review. And so we've analyzed those 2 different existing options that the ARB has and then recommended that one option for the HRB we're recommending is implementable immediately, and that would be the committee method, whereas the preliminary review method would require code changes and identification of establishment of fees and things like that, which is a much longer process. So we're essentially recommending that the board adopt a committee method of conducting study sessions for preliminary review of projects. Thank you.
Board will see that there are some there are some recommendations for us, yes. And that shows up on the page 3 of the staff report here. Any thoughts and comments of board members on these? Yeah, oh, please, go ahead. Yeah.
Matt and Amy, either one of you could answer this maybe. So, Matt, you just said that there was a preliminary review, ARB has a preliminary review. Is that staff only, or does that include the board?
That does include the board. That's specifically to provide, for the board to provide input to an applicant prior to a formal application review.
Okay, so that's a full board.
And I would add to that, the preliminary architecture review process, we do provide public notice to the same 600-foot radius. There's a formal staff report without a formal recommendation, and plans are circulated in advance with some analysis for consideration by board members ahead of schedule, whereas the subcommittee method does not come with a staff report. It can come, and we would suggest that it come with plans ahead of, in the packet for those subcommittee members.
Okay, so I have a couple of questions that arose when I read your staff recommendations. So if you bear with me. You're suggesting we establish a standing committee of 3. Would, and this review, a review by those 3 subcommittee members or committee members would occur after a board meeting. Could other board members sit in the audience and listen to that, or would that cause a quorum issue?
That's an interesting question. I hadn't thought of that. I mean, I think
so.
They're in the room. They, typically when somebody recuses themselves or leaves the room because they're conflicted, they leave. So it's not a situation where they're conflicted. I mean,
maybe you could check with the city attorney.
We could, yeah. I mean, we would suggest no more than 3, just to be clear and careful and all of that.
So maybe we couldn't be in the audience.
When Wynn Firth was part of the city attorney, she spoke to us about that. And she says a board member being in the audience could be perceived as participating because there could be a shrug, there could be, I mean, that was just her comment.
Right,
so she thought her recommendation was not even be in a room.
Right, but this would be an informal, not board review, so that's why I'm asking. If this is really sort of just, it's a non-judicial consideration of a project. So anyway, I'm just interested in whether that's a possibility.
We could certainly ask about it, but there is always the TV land that you can view in the comfort of your easy chair.
Right. So, exactly. So following along, this committee would provide preliminary comments. Those are not binding comments. They're just
correct.
Suggestions. Okay. There is a discussion of not causing a violation of Permit Streaming Act, and I'm not, I don't know what that means.
Well, so there's 2 state laws in effect that planning observes, at least 2. In this case, the Brown Act is the one that we're all aware of, right? Sunshine and you know about that one. And then the Permit Streamline Act requires us to take action, once a project is deemed complete, it requires us to notify an applicant that it's incomplete and give them, what is needed to make it complete. So that does come into play when we are, considering applications. And so there's a reference in here because that's part of what staff has to deal with. We don't want to string somebody along for too long without a decision. And I think that's the reference there.
Okay, so I guess you would notify the subcommittee members if that, if some streamlining act provision was going to be problematic. I mean, I just kind of figure out when, since this is very early in the process, I'm not sure how that would apply.
Thank you. So the Permit Streamlining Act would come into play if there's an actual formal application. So typically we're envisioning that applicants or prospective applicants will come to the board prior to filing an application. In some cases, though, they may have already filed an application, maybe going through a review process, and may want to still check in with the HRB with a study session. We just need to be careful, since there's already a filed application, that the Permit Streamlining Act at that point is in effect. And if, as staff, if an applicant requests a study session, but we've identified that there would be a violation of the Permit Streamlining Act, and the applicant doesn't clearly give us permission to extend that, then we would not schedule the study session. We simply wouldn't schedule it because it would cause a violation of this Permit Streamlining Act at that point.
So possibly what we ought to consider as a board is that the study sessions occur prior to a formal application. Isn't that the purpose of?
I would think that would be the norm. I would suggest, though, that we be flexible to allow, for instance, again, I'm using the ARB as an example, we have had staff-level architectural review applications submitted, and staff wanted to use the resource of several ARB members to consult with on this, what's considered a staff-level review, to make sure that it's not, something that should come to the full board. So, that's a possibility too, is that staff uses HRB members as a resource in a staff-level review.
Okay, one final question. I don't want to take up the whole morning. The suggestion is that these materials be submitted to the staff up to 10 days before. I'm thinking that if you make a 10-day statement, that you're going to get all of the materials 10 days before the meetings, and maybe you want to have a longer period so that you don't, the staff members, get inundated with, 2 weeks gives you more time. 10 days might be like the Monday before the next Thursday meeting or something. So it just struck me when I read that might be a kind of limited time period for you to prepare.
Yeah, I think with the HRB, since often meetings are canceled, we definitely need a certain amount of time to make sure there is a meeting scheduled. And so I think, the Monday before, the Friday before might be sufficient if there's only a subcommittee item. If there's already a scheduled meeting, then, that's enough time to get it on the agenda, and it's enough time for staff to look at it.
Sure. All right. Thank you.
Beth?
I had a couple of questions. One is that we, in other branches of the city, sometimes there is an additional person on the board named as a possible substitute. I'm really aware, particularly of architects' time, and the fact that sometimes it's just not all that convenient to fit in a meeting like this. So is there any room for saying, here's one more person who could come in if needed to replace one of the three?
Yeah.
We could consider having a pool of, willing HRB members, and, there could be, to allow the subcommittee meeting to continue in the absence, somebody sick that day or what have you, have like an alternate from the pool of willing participants.
Yeah, one of the other questions is, applicants sometimes, I think, must wonder, do they bring in conceptual plans for this sort of thing, or do they do the full-blown plan? That's a difficult and expensive process.
Yes, thank you. So the applicants won't be required to develop full project plans, full application materials, but they will be required to submit enough information for the committee to at least evaluate the project and provide some comments. So that's where staff is requiring that there be a submittal to staff, currently saying 10 days before the meeting, so that staff has time to review those preliminary materials and make sure that they are complete enough for review, and to request additional materials if necessary. We're thinking that at a minimum, the materials that should be submitted are property photographs, including architectural elevations, drawings of the proposed architectural elevations if the project is complex, if it can't be described in words, and ideally a site plan. Those would be some things that would be very useful. But for any particular project, we'll base it on the nature of the project in terms of is there enough information available.
All right, fine. And I also realize that there might be some costs involved in some of these. Can you talk a little bit about what the cost would be, or to be announced?
Sure. So, I mean, from staff's perspective, the costs would be receiving and reviewing the materials, which wouldn't take a very much amount of time, really. It's a quick scan to just understand if the project is understandable based on what's submitted, and then updating the agenda to include those projects or those prospective projects that have been submitted. Staff isn't developing a staff report for these. Staff will attend the committee meeting and participate as well. So from staff's perspective, the costs are minimal, and that's one reason that staff is actually recommending this particular process, is because it has very low impact on staff's current capacity, but allows the board to provide that input to homeowners and applicants who want that input.
Good. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Roger.
It's taking me a while to catch up, and I come from the far south of Palo Alto, so I'm kind of this is a preliminary review for a project where people submitted the drawings and have paid fees for? No.
There's no fee, so this would be, so we've had requests by property owners to get an early input by the Historic Resources Board on projects.
We've done that a lot. So
Sure.
I'm not quite sure what
developing
this whole meeting, why are we talking about this? Because it's a common, I mean, David and I and Martin, everyone has been on preliminary meetings all the time. So I'm just trying to figure out what's new that we're talking about.
So there's not a formal procedure identified for the Historic Resource Board to conduct these meetings, whereas the ARB, for instance, has two separate procedures. So this is actually developing a formal procedure by which the board can proceed with that activity in the future.
But it's the same as the one we've been using.
It provides the same function, but it provides a formal process that everyone can understand. And we think that that's very important for the public and staff.
So the formal process now means they pay a little fee and then submit drawings?
No, there's no fee. There is no fee for this preliminary
So I'm just trying to figure out
review.
what's the big difference between what we've been doing in the past?
I'm not sure there is a big difference. What we're saying is that we're applying a formal process, and the board would actually be establishing a formal process by which to conduct those study sessions rather than doing them on an ad hoc basis. That's the change.
I don't think they were ever done on an ad hoc basis. It was announced we were going to have this group meeting, and who would like to go and be as part of that member, not more than 3. So I mean, I think it's okay to make it. I'm just curious why it suddenly just sort of pops up. I mean, it's fine with me.
Right. The process you described is essentially an ad hoc process where, as it comes up, a committee is identified, members are identified. This would provide a more formal function on a regular basis for applicants, and it would also allow homeowners to understand that there's a process up front and exactly what's required to be submitted for that process. So it's just really providing the information to people.
The upside of this whole thing is maybe it could avoid a recent situation where people came to us with full-blown drawings and everything, and the project was rejected outright. So to me, announcing a formal process and having, here's what you can do is probably a good idea for a lot of these projects, because over the last couple of years, we've had some pretty ones that should not have come to us as a full project. And so to me, just formalizing is probably a good way to do it. Good, yeah.
Michael McKinnon.
I think I'm on now. Is it appropriate to make comments now, or just questions?
Let's go with questions, and I'll open up to the public. And then and then we'll have comments. So do you have a question, or we can wait until I come back?
Martin, there's a crowd outside waiting. Should I go get them?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So if you have a question, go ahead. Yeah.
I don't have any questions. I mainly have some comments.
Okay, we'll come back to that in a second. Board Member Chair, Vice Chair Wimmer.
I think there is already a similar process that I think that we're trying to maybe emulate with the IR program, because when you are submitting to do a new house or a second story addition, you're required to go through the city IR process. And
Actually, I don't think you're required. Are you?
yes, I believe so.
Strongly encouraged is, I believe, our official statement there.
Yeah, no, I've done some where I've just skipped over Arnold, which is very rare, but there have been a couple projects where we've just gone in. So no one said you had to have Arnold's review.
Well, I mean, I think you have to go through the IR process. Anyway, so and that's exactly what I was going to say, is that there is that consulting architect, Arnold Mammarella, who offers a preliminary study session. I believe it's $108 or $112, and you have to go online and pay for this meeting, and it's roughly an hour. And he schedules it, and he's usually with another planner, but I think that's been very effective because it's given applicants sort of upfront information, some feedback. So I think that's, I mean, in my mind, I think I can relate what were our efforts here to that process, maybe not so much the ARB process, because that's more commercial in nature, where I think a lot of our projects are residential in nature. So, I mean, I think it would be a really wise feature that we could offer, something similar to what Arnold does. And you can come in and meet with Arnold before you have a lot of formal drawings. It can be sketches, it can be just concepts, and I think it would be beneficial to our applicants to offer something like that.
Thank you. I've got one question before I move on with the agenda. If the board does agree to have this program, has staff had any thoughts about, or maybe staff has any thoughts about how this would be advertised? So when an applicant first goes to the development center and says, "Hi, I'm thinking of doing something," how would this applicant hear about this process if the board agrees to this?
Typically, the way we, we reach out to prospective applicants is through the website, the city's website, where we have information, and then at the development center, we have some handouts. We have the planning staff who are trained, to for new procedures or what have you. Ideally they can be the mouthpiece, on behalf of the HRB to say, oh, you have a historic, home, or you're in this neighborhood, and please know that we have this available process, and here's what we, here's a handout.
Sure.
Yeah.
Great. Okay, I'd like to open up the meeting to the public. I see no members of the public here and no speaker cards. I'd like to then close that portion of the meeting and bring it back to the board for comments. Board Member McKinnon.
Thank you, Chair Bernstein. I think the idea of the study session, I think I commend that idea. I think it's been very productive in our hearings here. One of the things I'm not too enthusiastic about is the subcommittee approach. My belief is that it tends to marginalize the rest of the HRB board by having a select group speak for the HRB. And we're not really oversubscribed right now with business. I would like to see the full HRB participate in this rather than having a study session. A select committee do the study session. I think it's a disservice to the HRB process, and it tends to marginalize the rest of the HRB members who are not part of this committee. And the second thing is, I think any fees associated with this should be minimal or non-existent, because it tends to discourage participation in the historic preservation process. I just don't see where that's gaining us any points and any productive encouragement of the public to participate in historic preservation. tack on fees to them. We should make this completely voluntary and try to get them in here, support the historic preservation program. That's my general.
Yeah, I mean,
general
it's,
feeling.
yeah, I mean, it's to have 7 board members offer it, sure. The staff, to have that a no-fee program, though, is that, maybe if there's a full board, then that implies that there has to be significant fees, or?
Well, starting with a full board, I think implies, you've gotten direction from the board that's more, formal, if you will, because it's, there's a quorum, and so now you're seeing how the board might vote on your project. So with less than a quorum, you're not risking that. Having said that, I mean, certainly there could be study sessions with the full board. That's an approach. For the ARB, we call that preliminary review, and it's in the code. And modifying the zoning code takes, going to the planning commission and formalizing that in the code, that kind of thing. And so, that's an approach we can talk about, and if that's how you would prefer to move forward, that can be a discussion, and we can.
Yeah, I don't think our process is broken right now, so why do we need to go to all these new approaches to it? I think it works pretty effective as it is.
Well, what we'd heard, I'm sorry to engage on, but what we'd heard is that you would like more people coming through the study session process, and so we looked into it to see, how it's structured. So I think that's why we're talking about it here, to make sure we have a structure for.
I think cutting the fees down to nothing would be the step one.
I mean, I've been through the Arnold review, 120 or 30 times, but the thing is, Arnold is it. When you meet with Arnold, he gets some pretty good input. There's seldom another person there. It's just a preliminary, you sit down. Well, for all the years they've been doing it, there was always Arnold and a staff person. And that staff person became the person who reviewed the plans when you submitted the drawings. And then suddenly in the last 6 months, no staff person, just Arnold by himself. He's not exactly sure why. He didn't really make a very clear answer when I asked him why not. But it seemed to me that the original program worked well. When Arnold was there and the staff person was there, the staff person could hear what Arnold said, the staff person could hear what the applicant said and the homeowner. And so when you left that room, you had a pretty good idea of where you were headed. And if you went in the direction both Arnold and staff were recommending, they don't actually recommend, they make suggestions, which they, is part of the process. And you submitted your drawings, the chances of them getting approved first time around are like 90%. And now when you go to see Arnold now, it's by himself, and the staff person's not there. So you don't know who the staff person is, and the staff person hasn't heard what Arnold said originally, and so then they take the plans and see the plans and look at it, and I don't know how they work separately, but they might say, ooh, why is this dormer right here? Whereas if you were in the meeting, it might have been Arnold's suggestion that, putting a dormer here might be a good idea to help it relate to the neighboring homes, or the roof line should be changed. So there seems to be a little bit of chain of command that's been eliminated, where you go meet Arnold by himself and you don't have the other staff person there. So if you had a preliminary review with what I'm trying to say is in that process, the IR review, you submit your drawings to the staff, to one person, and then that person becomes your person who reviews your drawings. And I assume that person also might go to Jody or you to look at the plans. They don't, huh?
I'm a little concerned that we're spending too much time on the IR without Jody being here. So
my point is the two review processes is what we're talking about. And I'm talking about that the Arnold review process worked very well when there was a staff person there. I'm not sure it works as well as it isn't.
So why don't we focus the comments on the HRB? So we've already said that the staff would be here for the HRB subcommittee review.
Well, what I'm
right?
wondering about as talk here says is that maybe we should just have the whole committee look at it. I don't quite understand, because then what happens is you have 1 or 2 or 3 people review the historic review process, and then you can make recommendations. You come to the meeting, so the other 4 people or whatever have to pick up on the knowledge. What I'm trying to say is you might be more efficient if it just came to the board and we did it in a one-shot thing.
Yeah, I was actually, after listening to what Michael had to say.
Why don't you wait till they're finished talking? That's my point, is that it seems to me more efficient to have it come to the board, it's a done deal, and then you meet with, if you have the preliminary, you meet with 2 or 3 of us, so then those people have took their time, then you have your meeting, you come here, and everything gets repeated again, and it seems to me this person right here has got a good idea.
Staff? Oh, staff.
Yeah, thank you, Board Member Kohler. We appreciate that input. I guess that might be something that the board as a whole might direct staff on in terms of preference for a committee versus the full board. And in just our discussions here, it would appear that there is a possibility to implement this same process basically in the same way we've described it, but to just include the full board at the end of the meeting, and the meeting wouldn't actually be formally ended, but it would be clear that the board's not making any decisions, that it is just study session, it's just non-binding comment at that point. And that it doesn't take the place of a formal review, which would still be required under the code typically. So that's a possibility. What we would perhaps recommend is that the board discuss that and then direct staff on that particular issue, because that does seem to be a crucial point moving forward, whether it's a committee versus a full board review. And then staff can consider that direction and come back with perhaps a revised proposal.
Yeah.
And I suppose you have to go to the legal end of it. The attorney's office has to review that as well. Is that...
Yeah, most likely we would do a code amendment, just like the preliminary architectural review, and certainly the council has waived fees for other processes. The single-story overlay is one of those processes where they said no fees. So, we can propose that in the code amendment.
Well, maybe a modest.
Okay, Board Member Wimmer.
Oh, I was responding to what Michael said, and I thought that, that there is a lot of truth to what he's saying, and when you have a subcommittee, then there's exclusive information that's exchanged during those times that's not shared with the entire board. So maybe, is there an opportunity for applicants to come to the board without preparing anything, just come kind of cold, and then without a fee, and maybe we give them a time constraint of 20 minutes or half hour, and they can just bounce their preliminary ideas off of us. I don't know.
Thank you. Staff does recommend that there be some pre-screening of materials and to ensure that there is enough information to review. Taking up 20 or 30 minutes of the board and staff's time without knowing that there's actually, a project that's been developed enough to comment on. So we really do strongly recommend that there be a requirement that there be a submittal to staff first, and that staff verify that the project's, at that point, there's enough information to review, essentially. In terms of the fee aspect, fully understand that, a fee may be an obstacle or impediment, thank you, impediment to someone perhaps coming to seek that advice. So staff is understanding that it would be ideal to have a no-fee process. In order to do that, that would involve basically no staff report, no review time on staff's part, except for really a quick scan just to make sure that there's enough materials to review. So I think we're still talking about a situation where, we're looking at information just to make sure there's enough to look at, but there won't be a written staff report, and there'll basically be kind of an open and even casual discussion with board members and staff on the project, and that's how the study session could proceed. Thank you.
Member Bunnenberg?
Is part of the requirement for this if we need to do a cost recovery, I know they like to recover costs within the whole city, and is that a part of the connection to changing the code so that it would allow?
Yeah, definitely the city is focused on cost recovery, as all cities are these days. So that's a consideration. Again, I know, if this were presented, say, in an ordinance to have something officially in our code, or perhaps we go the bylaws approach, and we can make it clear there. And then we do have a council member that is a liaison to this group. And they could be aware that we're, not charging for these things. I think we can come back and give more information on this approach.
One quick is the project we reviewed last meeting where we pretty much put our thumbs down to the project. So a preliminary review with them might have saved an awful lot of grief.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of benefit to it, and I think we've always encouraged that. Is that, hey, come talk to us before you put everything in stone there. Board Member Brower.
So I have two views of a committee approach and then the full board approach. I think Avenidas would suggest that the full board approach didn't really work. They came before us, showed us something, we all talked about it. They came back to us with something totally different, but was no better. My guess is that a smaller group of people, while some would not be included, might do what Roger is suggesting, and that is avoid the really big sort of train wrecks. I guess if we went that, and so I can see the advantages of both a full board review or a partial board review earlier. I think if we do the committee approach, we ought to be selecting the committee members at the meetings. I was on what we called the subcommittee a couple of years ago, and one of the board members didn't want to participate, and so only two of us were actually there making decisions. And we can't have that with a subcommittee or a smaller committee of the board doing reviews. So somehow we have to avoid that problem, and so I don't know what the solution to that is. I do think no fee is absolutely mandatory. We have to get people in to do this before fees are charged. And I think the staff report, the suggestions here, I think are a pretty good approach to this. And I think it's important to tell people up front that there is this opportunity to come without a lot of time in developing your ideas and see how that works. It's not going to be required for the architectural firms that do a lot of historic work with the city. They know what the board, finds acceptable, and they pretty much get their projects through. But the companies that come from afar that don't do a lot of work with us, we've had more complaints, we've had more requests for changes of those projects, and so something up front would be good.
Thank you, board members. So I just have a thought in terms of both the desire that we're hearing to include the full board, but also to provide that sort of focused committee review that could also be provided. Perhaps the board wants to consider the first study session would always be the full board, and if it becomes apparent through that full board review that the project is one of those types of projects that would benefit from a really focused, intensive review and comment period by a committee, the full board, the chair at that point, could actually appoint a committee for that specific project to work with that applicant and staff in that way that you're saying. That might be a way to incorporate, and then that committee could then report back to the full board in a study session at a future meeting. Might be a way to incorporate both of those concepts. Thank you.
Martin, can I ask a question?
Is that what we did for that project at I think it's 221 Kingsley, the house that was rotated? Didn't we have a full review? And then I think there was a couple people who created a subcommittee because they came back with materials and things. So I think
Right.
there is a precedent for that. I think we've done that
I
just
was
recently.
on that subcommittee.
Yeah, that we've done that kind of recently.
We also did that on the Stoller Court, formerly called Landing Chateau. We had that. We had study sessions,
Right.
and then we had a subcommittee kind of take it from there. So there's an example where full board and then subcommittee. Anyway, somebody.
We did that to work out sort of final details, some relatively small details. The board had already basically approved the overall concept, and we were looking at the particular window style and placement. So that's relatively minor. I think if you did the overall board and then you had a subcommittee, we're still talking about study sessions. So the project still has to come back for an official approval. And so I'm not sure that another smaller subcommittee after a full board study session, then that's 3 different versions of time. Yeah. Then we're not saving the applicants really any money, I think.
Just a couple differences between how a committee could work versus the full board is if there's a committee appointed, that committee doesn't necessarily have to meet in board meetings or even according to a schedule, and it doesn't have to be noticed, there doesn't have to be public attendance. So there could actually be a savings of time in terms of how that committee could operate. But there, again, that would involve the full board at both the beginning and the end of that process.
Yeah, right.
Well, again, the point I want to reiterate is that the process of subcommittees tends to create an HRB within the HRB, which I object to. I think you got a formal panel here that's been convened, and it should weigh in on these decisions as a full panel, not have select members preloading the decisions.
All right, good thoughts. I think the main thing, and I've been pushing this for a while, as long as other members have too, is that, let's get free advice. Let's have applicants have some free advice, and I think it helps the process. I think we end up with a better product. So if there can be a study session that is for the full board, then I think that goal can be met. So if there's a way that we can set that up more formally than what exists, I think that solves a good community goal. Yeah, Board Member Bauer.
So I'd like to make this.
Would that involve a code change? I'm sorry.
No, this doesn't require code change, right? Would this be a bylaw?
We'll return back with a method for if this is the pleasure of the board, we will come back to another meeting here and discuss it with, finality, with attorney input, et cetera.
So I'd like to make a proposal for, I don't know if a motion is what you're looking for, but I think we ought to include the whole board for study sessions, because that seems to be the consensus on the board. I think we could use the outline that staff has presented. I would like to actually articulate the materials needed. So the preliminary review by staff would have to include, number 1, a property description. I'm just taking this from your recommendation. Number 2, property photographs. Number 3, elevation drawings. Number 4, a site plan. And any other materials that they'd like to bring, if they've already worked out colors. Everything we can see helps move this forward, but I'm just saying others. And that it would be done just as you suggest, at the end of a meeting, noticed at the end of a meeting. I think 2 weeks would be a better time frame for initial, as a cutoff time. But if staff feels that's more time than you need, then you can tell us that. And then generally by the way, I'm open to any other suggestions by other board members as to how to structure this, but I do think we need to have a structure and have a articulated list.
May I add one additional item to your list right there? I give that a little thought right here, and just listen to this and see what you think. As far as materials that the applicant would submit, statement that historic characteristics that may be sensitive for the specific project or neighborhood that the project resides in. I think that would be a worthwhile addition to the submittal information.
Okay.
How it impacts, the adjacent neighborhood, their project.
Okay. I would add to the list floor plan. Yeah. Sure. Yeah. Responding to Board Member McKinnon's comment about, can you repeat your words again? The historic quality, you said?
Historic characteristics that may be sensitive for the specific project or neighborhood that the project resides in.
My comment on that is that's maybe asking perhaps an intimidating request for someone who wants to add onto their master bedroom suite or something like that. I'm thinking the study session could be a time when that question comes up for the applicant to think about, rather than having an applicant who may have no experience in this at all. Maybe less intimidating if that requirement is not on that list.
I guess specifically what comes to my mind when I see that is sometimes the desire of applicants to have lots of windows that overlook the neighbor's property, and that would be something that would be flagged under their considerations, that they would self-evaluate their project before it comes to us.
Okay, I'm confused, Michael. So I thought your comment was to have the applicant identify historic materials that might be altered or removed, but then the window thing doesn't make sense to me.
That was just an example. Just a general statement that they be sensitive to the historic nature of their project.
Yeah. I've gotten calls from potential applicants, and they have no knowledge of Secretary of Interior standards, no knowledge of historical impact on their property, because they're homeowners who are just, they're not in that world. So to make that a requirement, I think may start being a little intimidating for someone. So
I would say it's like a checklist, not a requirement necessarily.
Yeah. Okay. Well,
these are desirable things we'd like to see.
Yeah.
If they could.
That would show up during the study session, I think. That'd be our comment. I mean, that was my comment.
I would presume staff would tell any applicant that coming before the Historic Resources Board that the Secretary of Interior standards are the way in which the board will evaluate, one method in which the board evaluates a project, and thus encourage the applicant to read them. Now, that, it's complicated, it's not easy to understand, and there are varying interpretations, but nonetheless, that ought to be a minimum for any applicant that comes before this board.
Well, at least if that could be on, maybe if on the handout, if we develop a handout saying, hey, we've got these study sessions here, and topics that will be discussed will be compliance with the Secretary of Interior standards. Here's a website for that. Just so an owner can at least know that topic's going to come up.
Are the standards on our website under HRB?
The standards are available. There's a link to the standards.
Okay.
This information is available currently to the public, so it shouldn't, and it will be made available. Staff will let every applicant know what the standards of review are for any application prior to that review occurring.
Yeah. The comment that Board Member McKinnon is making, it's, that's going to be foremost on every board member's mind. Say, what's the impact on it? So I'm just, my comment was that how do you make this, how do you make the HRB as approachable as possible? And if we start seeing those kind of things that are important to us and that we're well versed on, that was my response to it.
I respect your viewpoint.
I have a quick question. In general, is staff, just out of curiosity, how much interest, comments, calls does you guys get about historic features buildings, houses? Is it, are you on the phone every day talking to a lot of people, or is it, I'm just kind of curious because we see what we get here, but in the background, what's your average day like in a sense? That might be helpful. I guess I'm prying, but I'm just kind of curious what the feeling is up there at the 5th floor as to historic situations.
Yes, thank you, Board Member Kohler. I am the staff person who's responsible for responding to historic resource review requests and preservation information. I receive, on average, at least 2 or 3 inquiries a day, either by email or by phone or even in person. I do have drop-in hours from 10:30 to 12:30 every Monday and Tuesday, where people can either make appointments or just drop in. And so I would say...
Have you had many calls on that?
Oh, yeah. I mean, in a typical week, I will probably have at least a dozen inquiries of, through all those different types of... So, just so the board and the public knows that there is a staff person available to provide information and consultation on historic preservation, in the same way that there's a consulting architect available for the individual review program. So there certainly is the interest, and if there were HRB study sessions available as well, part of my consultation would be to let those inquiring people know that they can also schedule an HRB study session if they want to take that additional step as well. Whether or not their project would even be subject to an HRB review in the future, they can always request that as a courtesy review, and I would think the board would be happy to grant that.
That's actually, to me, very encouraging news, and I'm not sure why we didn't ask this earlier, because I see every once in a while upstairs when I come by for something, but that's pretty neat, actually.
So Board Member Bauer has proposed a structure, and it seems like it's the idea of having a study session with the whole board. Matt has just commented that he gets a fair amount of inquiries, and if Matt is then able to include in his response to that question from the applicant, or prospective applicant, saying, and you've got this option too. Seems like it's would be a good, sweet deal. Yeah.
One thing just occurred to me while we were discussing this. I think that study sessions ought to be encouraged prior to a formal application. Because once the application is filed, then you have some other statutory duties that could be either obstructed or influenced by this. So in initial inquiries, if you can encourage study sessions before the formal application, I think that makes it easier for the applicant, makes it easier for the staff, and in some ways for us. I don't know that that'll always be the case, but
yeah. So is the Board Member Bauer's proposal clear enough? Do we need to repeat it?
Is it clear to the staff?
Yeah,
I believe it is.
Okay.
I just had a quick question. So, if an applicant comes and wants to do a study session, do they still have to provide all of the documents, and that all of those documents are given to us before the meeting? So that's kind of similar to a formal application. I guess I'm just trying to weigh the differences. There's a cost difference, and then the staff isn't presenting a thorough report. So those are the two profound differences, is that they can come to us without having a full staff report and without paying the fees, but they still have to have a certain level of drawings and documentation that they gather for us that we review before the study session. I guess what's the savings? Well, in my mind, I mean, if they're going to prepare this, they're going to prepare the same amount of documents as they probably would for a formal application.
Well, I think what we're trying to do is to, study sessions, I mean, we don't, we're all pretty intelligent about, they can almost just bring pictures of the house and say, here's what we want to do, without any drawings, I would think. So we can at least, they could come and say, well, we're gonna add a big bay window up on the gable where we're gonna remove the 100-year-old stained glass window there, and we're gonna put in a new bay window. That's the kind of, I mean, I don't know how, we want them to come and not make it difficult and a big deal, but we want to be able to we just,
Yeah. Well, I think the list that Matt Weintraub mentioned, I think that it's pretty, it's no building sections, no structural, no survey, something like that. So I think just because we need something to look at. So, okay. Yeah.
Chair Bernstein?
Yeah. Yes.
Yeah. Thank you, board members. With a formal application, there may be additional materials that are required, such as arborist reports, engineered site plans, things like that wouldn't, perhaps even a historic structures report, depending on, the questions that need to be answered. So there would be some savings in terms of the study session submittal. And the staff would allow some flexibility, too, in terms of the materials to be submitted. If the change is only a window change or a chimney change, perhaps a site plan isn't needed if there's photographs and a schematic of the replacement window, for instance. There certainly should be some economy, some savings for the applicant in the preliminary review process, or I should say the study session review process.
I mean, when the first contact will be with Matt Weintraub, and Matt can make a decision saying, okay, look, if you're just going to change this, make this window from this big to this big, then just show that photograph and whatever. And then if it's going to be more extensive, then Matt can suggest, okay, for the study session, you really need this, and that'll be kind of the filter through which
might be able to use the city's. The city has like a visual overlay of a property with the buildings on it. That would certainly, for an initial review, be adequate, just so we could see where the building is. I don't think you need to, excuse me, go through an architectural drawing, which would require a survey to put the building on an official.
I think
so that's why we're trying. What we're trying to do here is to lower the threshold cost.
Yeah. So I think Matt would be able to understand, okay, what would the board need to have a conversation, basically. So, good.
Elevations could be photographs marked up. I mean,
yeah, exactly. Perfect. Yeah.
That's an elevation. It doesn't have to be an architectural drawing.
All right. So we have a structure proposed by Board Member Bauer, and it seems like that's clear to staff what his proposal is. So are we ready to move to a motion to approve that? You want to make?
Is an official vote required? I thought this was a
what would staff prefer?
Yeah. Thank you, Chair Bernstein. So it's up to the pleasure of the board if they want to make a formal motion. I think we do hear pretty clearly what the direction of the board is. So I think unless there needs to be a formal decision, I think it's up to the pleasure of the board. I think we understand at this point, what the board is seeking and what we should, what questions we need to answer to return this back to the board.
Okay. So I make a recommendation or a motion.
Well, if the staff feels that they understand, the direction we've discussed, and if you're going to have to go back and do some research about whether this is a code change or a bylaws addition or whatever, it seems to me it's coming back to us where we'll be able to then read the whole thing through and have a formal hearing about it and make a decision.
So you can continue this this discussion. You've given us direction, and we can continue it to a date uncertain, and we can come back when having met with our attorneys and what have you, consulted the bylaws and the code.
So would it be helpful to have a vote that shows the support of the board? I mean,
You do a straw poll.
Yeah,
I think also, since there's not an actual decision being made, but there might be a decision in the future, I don't really think a vote is necessary. I think most appropriate technically would be a vote to continue the item, because the item remains open. So I think staff has understood the comments of the board, and I think it's just a matter of continuing the item and to a date certain.
So whatever you
to a date uncertain. Thank you.
So so I would add to my suggestion that we continue this to a date uncertain while staff does some research and helps us formulate the actual formal approach that we've talked about today.
Okay. I think board members all agree?
I believe that was a motion.
Yeah.
Is there a second?
Yeah. I'll second that motion. Any discussion on the motion before we vote? Okay, all in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Thank you. Okay. I believe that concludes that agenda item. Let's see what else we have here. Next would be board or staff announcements. And I do see something at our places regarding Mills Act. Board Member Bauer.
Yeah, thank you, Chair Bernstein. As you may remember, I don't know what you do with a webinar, whether you attend it or you listen to it, but I did spend an hour and a half really attending a discussion of the Mills Act that the California Foundation for California Preservation Foundation, thank you. So what I've done here is I typed up my notes, and I'll just really quickly go over this. The initial part of this in the history I was quite surprised at. I think I have the article section correct, but it is in the state constitution. It was passed as an amendment in 1976. In 1985, they made some administrative changes if you want to get out of the contract. And then in 2012, there were some more legislative changes. So the way in which the program is governed by the law is established by these three major initiatives. Most surprising to me, there are more than 90 Mills Act programs in the state of California. And those programs are adopted by cities either through ordinance or through, there's another method where they can just approve a program without providing an ordinance. The costs range from a few $100s in some cities to up to $6,500. Beverly Hills was given as an example as a $1,500 application fee. $6,500 was considered pretty high. The reason you create a Mills Act program in a city is to preserve historic properties. That's what it's for. You're lowering the property taxes for private properties, commercial properties as well, but there are easier routes to include a commercial property in an historic preservation program. It puts a covenant on the property, so that rides with the property even if the ownership changes. Terms are typically 10 years. That was part of the 1985 amendment. They're renewed on a yearly basis. Each individual entity makes the determination when they create the program about how long they last. The tax assessor's office calculates the tax savings, and it's complicated. I mean, it was not intuitive when they described it, and that's something that would need to be understood better. And the tax savings are applied to maintenance and restoration of these properties. So the owner doesn't just get a big tax break. That tax break has to be applied to the building to make it, to prolong its useful life. When you implement a program, you basically define what you want to accomplish, figure out the number of years. Most cities decide that a certain number of Mills Act contracts, a total number in the city, so that they don't get overwhelmed by applications. And that's an important consideration. Also, they set limits on how much of the property tax can be offset. In Moravia, they have a very successful program that's been in use for many years. They have very few buildings over $1 million. Very few. They said maybe less than half a dozen. Palo Alto has every building over $1 million. But they still set a $1 million limit. And that's a pretty common, according to this seminar. And that's important because the property taxes are going to diminish the revenue to other agencies. So there'll be a lot of pushback to doing this. But when you consider that many of the new houses built now are $3.5 million, you could say up to $1 million could be offset for an existing property. You have to have a review by the city, and you have to establish contract conditions, and some of them are like preserving the exterior facades, preserving landscape, creating views of the property. Several communities have a requirement that if you have shrubbery or fencing that obscures the public's view of the property, that has to come down. The other thing that was quite interesting is they found that many historic buildings do not have real foundations, have very poor electrical systems. So there's a safety inspection to make sure that if the city is going to invest this money by offsetting property taxes, that the building doesn't burn down because of bad wiring or in an earthquake fall off the foundation and be destroyed. So almost all the programs they discussed had a 10-year seismic upgrade requirement as well. And that can be scheduled, and it's, you know, the owners work with the city. So, and of course, any Mills Act property has an IR review for everything that happens to the property, so that some owner can't get a contract and then strip all the back of the, you know, just leave the front facade, for instance, and strip off everything in the back. So I would encourage you to, I think they'll have this webinar again. It's really interesting, hour and a half. You do it on your computer so you don't have to travel. I'd like to recommend, Chair Bernstein, that you, that the board actually find a committee of people to move this forward by filling in some of these blanks, and that we could then, so that we could then present this to staff with staff's help, and then eventually get it to the council and move this forward. This is one of the best incentive programs for conserving residential properties that is available, according to the people in this.
Okay, I think, you know, this is another vehicle for historic preservation. Beth?
For a study session at some point, because it seems to me there are two areas where we continue to run into some difficulties. And one is in terms of preservation of historic fabric. It seems like that's one that often proves to be a problem as the rehabilitation work progresses. And the other one is of moving structures within the lot lines of the property, and questions on how it will be done, and are they taking it down to the studs, so that just to get a clearer view of what we see at this point.
Let's continue with Board Member Bauer's comment on Mills Act, then we'll address, yours is a separate subject, it sounds like.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, let's continue on with Board Member Bauer's suggestion for were you suggesting it was a subcommittee to look at this? Good.
I think that's,
yeah.
Sorry, I think that's what, in a brief conversation I had with a staff member, that was one of the suggestions to move this forward. Eventually, staff's going to have to pick this up and flesh it out, but
Sure. Okay.
we need to start somewhere. And
Okay.
I just felt after listening to this seminar that I had a sense of, you know, how we could make this work for us.
Okay, so if the board is willing, we can entertain a subcommittee to do some research on this. Go ahead, yes. Go ahead.
Point of order, Chair Bernstein, excuse me. So this is technically an item where it's actually limited to announcements, and there can be a little bit of information exchange, but there can't be a real discussion, nor can there actually be an action taken. However, I think what the board could do is direct staff to agendize this specific item for a future agenda, in which case, you know, then there could be further discussion and action could be taken. So that, procedurally, that would be staff's recommendation.
Okay, that's acceptable. Yeah. Okay, so if we could include that as an action item for staff to present, to put it on the agenda an upcoming agenda. Okay.
And then would my suggestion be a separate, similar kind of thing?
Okay.
Yeah, so I think your suggestion was that we consider having two study sessions, one for each topic.
Yeah.
I would also say that every year the HRB has a joint meeting with the city council. Those are always, venues at which to bring up, recommendations for, council to direct staff to do work. In this case, the Mills Act is your thought. So, leading up to that meeting with the council, we have, prep meetings, and certainly that would be an opportunity to, discuss, coming to the full board, having a full discussion in advance of that meeting with the council. And any of these topics could be on a meeting where we discuss what is going to be discussed with the council.
I certainly think that's a good idea. I'd like to have something to actually give the council and say, this is what we've been working on, this is what we want to move forward with. Because what we've heard from the council is, why aren't you doing this? Why aren't you doing that? And I think this is a way to satisfy those requests. So agendizing it is fine. I think just enough so we can get started.
Okay, any other board members or staff announcements?
Yes, Chair Bernstein, thank you. Just to update you on the Professorville Historic District Design Guidelines, they were earlier scheduled to be presented. The final guidelines were scheduled to be presented at this meeting. We've pushed that back to the July 28th meeting in order to give staff and the consultant staff additional time to incorporate the comments that we've received so far from the board and from the public, which have been very valuable and productive. So we just want to make sure that we take the time to thoughtfully incorporate those comments so that the final design guidelines that you see will reflect the input that has been given. So again, July 28th is the date that those are, that the final design guidelines are scheduled to be presented to the HRB for recommendation. The scheduled city council date remains September 12th for the council to consider adoption of the final design guidelines. And last, I just have a request for each of the board members to please, what we're going to do is you're going to receive new file folders that are going to look a little different. I think they're green. So those will be the file folders that staff gives to you and that you should give back to staff. You're more than welcome to keep these blue folders for your own use, for your own organization if you like, or to discard them or return them. But you will be getting new folders. And maybe it's helpful to have two different folders. One is the folder that the current folder, and then maybe the blue folder is your archive folder or something. But that's entirely up to the board members. Those are my announcements. Thank you.
I also have an announcement or two. One is that the topic of the individual review program came up today, and I want to alert the HRB that there has been a report auditing the program, getting feedback from various stakeholders, and that report is going to the Planning and Transportation Commission on August 10th. So once that report the staff report about the report is prepared, and we release that with the staff report to the Planning Commission, if you're interested, I can forward that report to you all. The second, and in that report, there's a mention of the Eichler design guidelines, and those of you who are interested in mid-century modern, which is most of you, I think are all of you, we are preparing a request for qualifications and ultimately a request for proposals to receive proposals for Eichler design guidelines. And this is coming down from council as a result of the single-story overlay program that brought up some issues that there are folks out there that want to be able to add 2 stories. And so they're against, having 1-story overlay, but they want to see some kind of, either conservation district for Eichler neighborhood tracts, or they want to have some Eichler guidelines that can be utilized by staff and boards, commissions. So placeholder on that is, let's see, I think September 12th, I believe. No, actually, it might be later than that, but that's a target date for discussion.
Could I just make note, I won't be here on July 28th, I'll be out of town, and September 12th is the opening Monday night of the NFL season. Maybe not the best. I don't know who schedules that, but I won't be available to talk to the council. I know
we do not have a date yet for the joint meeting with council, so I will find out what that date is, and we will let the board know.
No, I'm talking about, Matt said the guidelines are going to go to council on September 12th.
Yes, city council meetings are scheduled for Monday. During football season, that does coincide or conflict with NFL
Okay,
games. But we do have to do business in the city, so.
Just hoping that all those council members who are sitting at home watching us right now, because this is such important business, will hear that.
Do hope we have a quorum.
Any other items on for board staff announcements? Seeing none, we are, any announcements from staff? No.
None additional, thank you.
Okay, we are adjourned. Thank you.